Okay, it's about 6:03. So if everybody can hear me okay and everything's good, I'm gonna go ahead and start and let people trickle in. Um, is my audio okay for everybody so far? Yeah, awesome. Okay. My name is Kat. I'm an AmeriCorps member serving with Conservation Nebraska's Common Ground program. Conservation Nebraska's mission is to protect our state's natural legacy by educating the public, supporting our communities, and increasing civic engagement. This fine evening, what we believe is our third in the permaculture series, a presentation on permaculture design and greenhouse gardening with Gus Von Rowan, the founder and executive director of Omaha Permaculture, which is a local nonprofit that aims to foster community through land stewardship. Please be aware, all of you, that by default, all audience members' cameras are off and microphones are muted, so the speaker cannot see or hear you. Please go ahead and leave any questions you have in the Q&A section on Zoom, and we will go over all the questions at the end following the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, so it will be going on our YouTube channel in about a week or two after the webinar is done. So anything you miss, anything you want to go over again, you can catch it on our YouTube channel on YouTube at Conservation Nebraska. And I will give it over to you, Gus.
All right. Well, thanks, Kat. And thank you, everybody, for showing up on a Thursday evening. I'm sure there's beautiful weather, but basically, we're having a great presentation for you this evening about how to use greenhouses effectively in our cold Nebraska climate. I am kind of snowballing. This is a kind of a monthly webinar. So I'm kind of going over the basics of permaculture design, and now greenhouses. So I am going to begin with sharing a PowerPoint presentation, but feel free to inquire any questions, stop and slow down. I'll be paying attention to the chat section. So just let me know, and Kat and Sarah will be able to kind of signal and let me know that, hey, maybe we should slow down and answer a few questions. And I have no problem doing that. Thank you so much for being here. All right, I will share the screen. All right. So, as I mentioned, we are going to be focusing tonight on permaculture design and greenhouse gardening. And the first 9 slides or so, we're going to go over the definition of permaculture, and then subsequently, what is permaculture design, which is really the big point of how we use permaculture. And then lastly, why are greenhouses so important when designing your permaculture system? So without any ado, I'm going to start by explaining permaculture as an ideology. It is basically an ideology guided by ethics. And for first of all, you're going to be taking care of the earth, taking care of people. And then if you have any extras or excess time, money, energy, materials, that you return those back to the system, or return them back to your neighborhood or your community. So we're kind of helping those people that are less fortunate in our neighborhood and our community. So this is kind of a cycle, a social cycle. A cycle is a common theme in permaculture, whether it's wastes of anything. You're never just throwing anything away, but it actually is included back into the next seasonal cycle. But up here at the top, you're going to see the kind of phrase of a longer definition, the 9 different points, and I'll kind of explain each one, why each concept is important. So permaculture is sustainable land use design. So it's designing landscapes so that it works efficiently and effectively. So as you can see in front of you, you have kind of a contoured landscape with hills and ridges, a valley, and even a little river or creek kind of going through the middle of it. And so that would be the low point. So as you can see, there's kind of descriptions of what you could be doing at different parts of the landscape. On the hills, you may not be wanting to put a lot of the things that require more care, more moisture, more heat, more cooled, especially in a Nebraska climate. And then things that you want to stay more moist or wet in along is you put alongside near where the creek is, because that's the low point. So conversely, the hills will be a little drier on a regular basis, regardless of a drought or not. So understanding where the nice points for moisture, for heat, for cool, and understanding that in the landscape context is an important part for landscape design. Permaculture design is based on ecological and biological principles, often using patterns that occur in nature to maximize effect while minimizing waste. That is the word that's covered up by the picture. So the two pictures you have in front of us are patterns and that occur in nature. And there's actually logic and efficiency when in a pine cone, it can spiral out in that Fibonacci spiral sequence. So to release the seeds in an efficient and energy-saving method. Similarly, when water travels through the landscape, and then it creates this meandering, winding path through the landscape. It's an easy way for the water to discharge silt and sediment. So every time it goes through a wind, the turbulence, the flow changes. So there's a logic behind this pattern and this design. And when you do permaculture design, you consider that these patterns are an effective way to distribute energy and be efficient with water. Permaculture design aims to create stable, productive systems that provide for human needs, harmoniously integrating the land with its inhabitants. So I kind of Googled a picture of what would be the most ideal coexistence of nature and mankind, humanity. And here we have the hilltops being relatively left untouched or forested, allowing all the nutrients that are stored and collected from those hilltops to slowly trickle down into the landscape and benefit the agricultural fields below it. And then lastly, because of the ravines and so forth, though everything that is able to flow through it and continue through. So the terraces allow agriculture to catch all the fine materials and retain some of its best soil. So this landscape looks like it would be one of the most effective and efficient landscapes for being able to exist with nature, but still produce food for people. And here are some complicated graphs and cycles, but basically you're not meant to see all these details other than the fact that you're just seeing a system. But the ecological processes of plants and animals and nutrient cycles, climatic factors, and weather cycles are all part of the picture for permaculture design. And as you can see, the animal life cycles, whether we're talking about chickens to the butterflies to insects, all other insects, that they have cycles that are begin in the ground, begin deep in the soil. Sometimes they occur in the trees, on the grass. They occur in the landscape around us, and they are very much a part of the landscape in front of us. And it's important to understand when those cycles are beginning or winding down or peaking. Similarly, on the lower right, we're looking at our kind of climate and what we are normally receiving in winter is the cold air that comes down from the polar vortex, polar north air, northern winds, and then conversely, when the summer comes, we flip and we get the warm air coming up from the Gulf of Mexico. I guess other parts of the country have a more predictable weather pattern. Here in Nebraska, we talk about the weather a lot because the wind shifts on a regular basis. And so we're always having to talk about what is the weather going to give us today. And so that's important to understand is one of these many variables of how do you design your landscape effectively. And here's a cross section of an earth ship. But if in case you're not familiar, so it's kind of a very intentional design of a structure. But the inhabitants' needs are provided for using proven technologies for food, energy, shelter, and infrastructure. So that's another important principle and concept in permaculture. Elements in a system are viewed in relationship to other elements where the outputs of one element becomes the inputs of another system. And so really the only point of this slide here is to point out the fact that you may have outputs, but those outputs are not always your products, but they are outputs nevertheless, and they have an opportunity to be able to be potentially an input for the next seasonal cycle on your in your backyard, on your farmstead, or whatever we're talking about. And then within a permaculture system, if it's done correctly, work is minimized, waste become resources, productivity and yields increase, and environments are restored. So here we have a before and after photo, and left, with given a little bit of encouragement, some drip irrigation to this picture on the left, and the right climatic factors, you can turn any arid situation into something most abundant and productive. Permaculture principles can be applied to any environment, from dense urban developments to individual homes, and from farms to entire regions. So we have an example of a farm in the lower left, one of our nonprofit's farms in northern Omaha. It's about 2.5 acres. And then on the right here, we have a farmer in Illinois, Mark Shepard, who farms about 220 acres. And so as you can tell, it's not your typical kind of center pivot farmed field here. It's definitely encouraging, done along contour. And that's why you can kind of see all the patterns following the hills and the valleys of the landscape. So here is that definition that I've been going through here. Permaculture is sustainable land use design, but it provides many and accounts for many ecological processes and variables to understand and deliver an effective design. If you wanted to more simplify and really focus on the main things that you could be doing that are permaculture in your house, in your backyard, and in your neighborhood, the big 6 things that I would focus on are: 1, to catch and store rainwater; 2, what everybody knows permaculture for is to grow your own food; and then 3, create your own resources. Solar and wind energy, or the technology is improving and the costs are coming down. And also 4, build or retrofit your home to heat and cool itself. So just being more effective and efficient with the energy you do use. 5, reduce or create zero waste. Really try to not use all that single-use plastic that is pervasive everywhere in our lives. And then lastly, and I would say most importantly, and what differentiates permaculture from other sustainability, agriculture, regenerative endeavors, is get to know your neighbors. It's a kind of an open source social endeavor of making sure that you use the skills or get to know the skills of people around you in your neighborhood, because they may know a lot of things and can provide and help you with a lot of things, so that you don't feel like you're starting from scratch. So that's always nice to be able to get some help in the neighborhood. And farming, urban farming is nothing new. Here's a picture from 1917 in Delaware, I believe. And it's obviously in an urban setting with the houses in the background. And back then, there wasn't kind of a divide between where our food was produced, but it was very commonplace to be able to grow your food in just the vacant properties around your yard. And this is something that Omaha Permaculture has tried to create a model from to restore that connection in the city of you growing your own food for you and your family. So lastly, or next, I am going to talk about what is permaculture design specifically. The last ones were more about permaculture and all of its, as an ideology, as a way of looking at the landscape and the climate and the environment around you. But when you apply all those principles and concepts, you're able to design a very efficient and effective landscape around you. So when you design landscapes, you're taking into account how big is your land or how big is your property. And here we're kind of just in a quick little sample here. The picture to the left, it looks like maybe about a half acre to an acre property. And you kind of lay out, and this is the kind of your typical, you use an aerial photograph to be able to kind of draw where things go. But when you consider your daily activities, you want to be able to break up your landscape into zones. And those zones are determined, zone 1, 2, 3 through 5, are determined by how often you actually visit that zone or you go through that area. So zone 1 would be the closest to your house, to your garage, wherever you're on a daily walking routine. And then peeling away, zone 2 would also imply that you're there often, but less often. And then along the same logic, zone 3 and zone 4 on a half acre to an acre property, that's about about as much as you would have. Most people don't have a zone 5. Zone 5 is for people with many acres, and that zone 5 is left kind of untouched, undisturbed, so that nature can kind of be a buffer or a barrier of some sort, and be able to create resilience within your landscape. But these zones allow you to understand and design accordingly so that you have more intentionality with your most proximity closer to the house. So that zone 1 is going to be something very important to design. And then depending on how active you are in your yard or your landscape, you will spend as much effort on zone 2 through 4. But please let me know if you have any more questions about zones. And then here's a kind of a little bit more flush out of what you could be doing in those zones and what you would be designing them for. This type of strategy, whether you want a climate that's very cozy around the house, what kind of plants you're going to be using, how are you going to be pruning, what types of trees and plants, what are you going to be doing with water, and then what kinds of structures. And in our case of this evening, down there at the structures, greenhouses, and where they belong, probably in zone 1 or 2 down there at the bottom. All right, I'm going to move the next one. And here's kind of a designer checklist. If you're going through, thinking of all the things that you want to intentionally place in your landscape and in your backyard. These are all the types of different things you want to see. You want to know the history of the land. You want to understand, what is the context of the neighborhood itself. You want to understand other plantings, activities of neighbors, resources in the neighborhood, getting to know them. Utilities, where are they? Where does the shade line up? What is the wind direction? And what is the most prevalent wind direction? Average and recorded temperatures, highs and lows for your area, rainfall, where does the rain mostly flow? Understanding the contour, are there places, you have low spots, does water pool? Traffic, vegetation, location of structures, your view, just your vista, and then access of being able to move materials around and our routes and all those things. So this is a good thing to be able to go through a checklist and understand all these dynamics before you put pen to paper and kind of draw out what your landscape could be. And here is an ideal situation. In Nebraska, we get our warmth, especially in winter, when the sun is low in the sky. It's in the low azimuth. And because we want to absorb as much of that low winter solar activity as possible, we would love to have our homestead or our backyard or whatever we're designing facing south in an ideal world. That'd be perfect because that's where you can capture the most heat for roughly half of the year here in Nebraska. That's almost 5 to 6 months where you have to turn on the furnace. But here in this graphic, I'm talking about if you had a steep hill or you're on contour, what are the best places on that hill from high all the way down to the low where you might design things. And for the intents and purpose of this evening's presentation, if you look at the middle there, we have home site, greenhouses, animal paddock, and earth and animal shelter. So right about mid-grade would be a perfect place to put a greenhouse in the middle of the hill. You don't necessarily want it high on the hill because you'd be spending more energy, it'd be more susceptible to the wind, and you don't necessarily want to be low in the landscape just in case there's a big downpour or rain. You don't want to be your soil to be inundated with all of that kind of running water and flooding. Okay, next. Here is just when you do design, considering the kind of organic nature of plants that overflow. So like when you're carving out your design early in spring, just here from water, understanding that it's going to take on another look by the end of the year, and knowing where you want to be able to walk and be able to move water around and is something to consider when doing a design. And this is a really neat trick or a neat kind of model, I would say, of especially in a cold climate such as Nebraska, is a perennial edible sun trap. And if you can imagine that horseshoe is facing south. So on the back side of that horseshoe, on the upper part where all those trees are, is the north facing side where you are blocking the cold north winds. And yet in the middle of that horseshoe is hopefully the warmest part of that, and also trapping in moisture and less susceptible to the winds. So if you were to do this perennial edible sun trap, at least a half-acre scale, if not bigger, you'd be able to probably farm or garden a month longer in fall and a month longer in spring. This extends your season. It creates more warmth and holds moisture around a little bit longer. So these are just some ideas about permaculture design. And next, I'm going to move into why are greenhouses so important in a permaculture system. For one, when everything turns brown and all the leaves drop, I still like to see green things. I like to be around living plants, and I love to have greenhouses around me, sunrooms, anything where you have, a lot of sun pouring in a window is a great place to have a window or a plant or a terrarium or something along those lines that allow you to at least have house plants. But if you did something more formal with a greenhouse, you would be able to grow your own food. So a low energy greenhouse can provide plant protection from really the weather, cold, downpours, and hail. So in our winters, we've been getting some very cold moments, -20 wind chill as of the last couple winters. And that has really tested what we are capable of doing in some of just these unheated greenhouses or unheated cold frames. But having said that, once the -20s, are behind us, you would be able to seed and have perennial gardens within these cold frames. It's just a matter of kind of peeling away and letting them vent throughout the year. But we could also jumpstart a growing season with seeding flats months before their projected planting dates. So let's say you like a certain kind of pepper, but without needing to spend a lot of money on energy, you can sow those seeds in little flats and pans in a pot, however you want to do it, old discarded cups. And you can put that in your greenhouse, unheated greenhouse. You could put it in your window, south-facing window, and just make sure it has adequate moisture, not too much. And you would be able to start those in February and January. And by the time you would be able to put those in the ground, which around here is late May or early June, you will already have a plant that's, a couple inches, maybe even a foot tall. And that's a nice jump start for being able to start your garden. And you didn't have to go to the box store. You just had to uh, go buy some seeds or save your seeds from the prior year. Um, and then lastly, system efficiency is one of the biggest goals in permaculture design. A well-designed greenhouse system can amplify the productivity of an outdoor growing season. So if you run a farm and you're trying to bring things to market, being able to lean onto a greenhouse system that is at the core, at the heart, while it's still cold out, uh, really allows you to amplify what your farm is capable of doing throughout when the weather does bloom and the weather does come out and it's warm enough for sowing the seeds and plants out and outside. So one of the first things you want to think about is, where would you put a greenhouse? And I'll have many slides that kind of talk about this in the following slides. But I think thinking about what the slides will do, or thinking about where the greenhouse will be and what makes sense and how often you'll be able to go out there and enjoy it, or these are things that are also very important when siting it. And in my opinion, the best place for a greenhouse is the south-facing side of your house, your garage, or a building as a lean-to structure. And the reason I say that is because it is completely blocked by the north wind. So that means it really doesn't have to be as well insulated in some respect, because the north wall is a structure that may even be heated. So that residual heat from the structure could actually potentially keep your greenhouse warmer, thereby using less energy. And then another important reason is to be able to use that energy during the day that you collect during the greenhouse to be able to heat the structure behind it. So it's kind of a trading situation, but it's ultimately you're collecting heat and you're insulating from the north wind. Excuse me. And the next best place is tucked and blocked behind a windbreak from that northwest corner where the north wind usually comes from. It usually comes pretty cold and it's blistering on a normal Nebraska winter day. And if you don't have a structure or a house, to be able to put on a south-facing side, for whatever reason, maybe that's the wrong, maybe that's where your front door is. The next best place is a windbreak. Or maybe it might be adjacent neighbor houses and their garages that you can kind of politely strategically place your greenhouse so that it is being blocked by these other structures, neighbor structures. And then as I mentioned in one of the previous slides, understanding the grade, making sure that you're not putting your greenhouse in a low spot and maybe avoiding a high spot. Mid-grade is probably the best place to put your greenhouse. And so these are kind of some graphics just kind of explaining what that north wind is doing and why you really want to buffer your greenhouse. Because if it's just out there in the middle and it has nothing blocking it, you can imagine that it's just got plastic, or it's got glass or Lexan or some kind of plastic, that is not an insulating material at all. So it may be great during the warmth of the day on a sunny day. It may get the temperatures sometimes up to 80 or 90 degrees. But as soon as the sun goes down and that winter wind comes through at night, whatever it is outside, and we get 10 degrees, 0 degrees. Sometimes we're supposed to get 20 degrees in the next few days. Those cold temperatures, affect your little baby starts, and so to understand, the weather sensitivities of your plants, and then at the same time, how insulated your house is, determines how much you need to bundle it up for a cold night, or whether or not you can keep it open and vented for some of our nights as well. So understanding what wind does when it goes through the neighborhoods and it goes through your farm or your homestead, this is an important thing to understand. And here's just some explanations of R values. That's the insulator. And I was talking a little bit about greenhouse and plastic and glass. There's practically no R value into it, but the reason you want to have at least some understanding of R value in insulation is for that north wall. So the most important side of any greenhouse in Nebraska is the south wall. And then secondly, your east and west walls, but your north side, you can be very creative. You can come up with hay bales, you can do leaf bags. There are a lot of ways, wood chips, mulch, pallets. There are a lot of ways to make sure that north wall is insulated well and blocking some of the worst of that cold wind, especially if you don't have a lean-to greenhouse design. And then another thing about siding, I have two graphics here that I used last month for the energy presentation, but they still have great application here, especially in that main graphic here. When you see what shade is in that first illustration, it says letter A. In summer, the shade is shading the house if it's planted close. Well, imagine if that's a greenhouse. In summer, we don't really need much sun in our greenhouses. Sometimes the greenhouses are not even used much in the heat of summer, in the heart of summer. So being able to plant trees next to your greenhouse or on the front of the south-facing side is not necessarily a problem. And it actually helps you shade and cool off that greenhouse during the summer, because as you can tell, on the winter side, the sun is actually revealed and allowed to come through all of those where the leaves were. And now you just get the limbs, the shadow of the limbs that kind of come through every now and then, which isn't really blocking much of the sun. So being able to keep your greenhouse, even with trees on the south facing side, because the angle of the sun is coming from kind of a lower angle, that you're going to get plenty of sun coming through there, minus when it hits the trunk of the tree and that minor shadow comes through. And then lastly, on the right there, we're talking about the angle of the sun. But the most important feature is that kind of lip that comes right after the roof, or right above or right below the roof. But and it's kind of like an awning approach, but it's just like a flat visor, so to speak. And that visor, if you can see on the top picture there, is providing protection from the high sun of summer that wants to come here and come into the greenhouse. And that visor is actually protecting the sun from its hottest summer days of August and July to come straight down and protect as a kind of a mini visor for those hot summer days. Granted, we're not growing much in summer, but it allows you to at least keep that greenhouse cooler so you don't have to vent it or use energy to have to vent it, excuse me. And then conversely, that visor is out of the way come in winter when you want to absorb and collect as much of that low angle sun as possible. So while these graphics are great for understanding, your windows and your house, it actually has great application for greenhouses as well. And here's a neat cross section of what is one of my favorite greenhouse styles. It's the lean-to design. And this is showing how you can actually, without any fans, show that there is a movement of air. You can see that cycle that's right there with the squiggly arrows that shows that warm air will want to move. It's a more agitated air, and if you create an opening high up in your greenhouse, it'll go into your living space. And then conversely, if you have a low gap kind of at the foot of the greenhouse, it'll allow some of the cooler air to get replaced and move into the greenhouse, thereby cooling the greenhouse on a hot day, but at the same time, allowing that air to kind of cycle through. So fresh air is always being moved through your living space as well as a green space. But other things that you can see in this cross section, they use polyethylene. You can use corrugated Lexan. And notice up at the top, it says a partial shade for summer. That's that kind of visor thing I was telling you about, because in summer, otherwise greenhouses are not very useful. You're really trying to shed a lot of that excess heat. Then they also here in the middle, it says a water-filled drum. A water-filled drum is kind of a heat bank or a store of heat, because if it's painted a dark color, something like black or brown, that the sun hits that and it raises the temperature of that heat bank. And then over the cold night, it slowly releases that heat into the greenhouse so that you don't have to use radiators or something along those lines. And the nice thing about the angle of this roof is that it's allowing the angle of the sun to come in and meet at the low winter sun angle and meet and enter the greenhouse at a perpendicular way, so it's not creating a reflection. And then secondly, you're thinking about snow weight. That's another thing that I'll be showing here in the next slide or two. And I'm revisiting the cross section of the Earthship, which I showed in one of the early slides about permaculture, basically talking about how to create a system that lowers your carbon footprint. But it actually has excellent application here when we talk about a greenhouse, because you could layer in a lot of renewable energy. You can be using a lot of upcycled items. The Earthship is famous for using rammed earth tires. And those tires are seen in the back, where it creates kind of like a heat bank. It stores and protects the heat that is and insulates the living space well. But an Earthship is also famous for catching its own water, recycling its own waste, and then turning that waste and using that waste to actually to create nutrition for the next planting cycle, as well as your own, what you're doing with your restroom situation, being able to use that compost and integrate it into your greenhouse. So greenhouses have many applications here in Nebraska. Just simply adding windows to any south-facing structure, whether you're living in it or whether you want plants in your garden in there, a lot of the principles are still very similar. Just you'd be controlling humidity differences is probably the biggest difference. So now I'm going to go through some kind of styles, and you can see the pages. I've taken these styles from out of a book that I use, an ortho greenhouse book that showed the different styles. And one on the left is kind of your lowest cost one, hoop houses, very easy to make, and does a good job of giving a lot of headroom so that you can walk through and not, and be able to work in many parts of the space. You're creating lower beds, and then also at the same time, it does shed snow pretty well. The second one on the one on the right, which is the A-frame, have steep sides. So if you live in an area like Colorado, where you get lots of snow, or let's say Buffalo, New York, or something where you get dumps of snow, then this is the right design for you, because all of that snow will immediately shed off and it won't have any issue in sitting there and resting on it for too long before it may sit down and collapse on your system. And then halfway in between that, the lower left picture is the Gothic greenhouse style, which it marries the best of. So between a Colorado and an area that doesn't get as much snow, you can choose the Gothic style. It gives you a little bit more headroom as you walk through that area. A nice thing about the Gothic style is if you get a lot of heat and you're still using it, that you can use that peak part to create venting on both sides of the greenhouse, so that venting can flow through. All your hottest air will be able to leave. And that's kind of a rule of thumb with most of these like smaller greenhouses, is you want you want some panels to be able to be opened and closed according to the daily weather. If you anticipate a really cold night, like we have a few 20 degrees coming up, that's when you will be closing those vents. But knowing that the next day it's going to come up to 50 or 60, that you will need to be opening those vents. And then lastly, on the lower right, we have kind of a nicer, probably glass style greenhouse. An A-frame gives you plenty of headroom. You can put things on shelves, but this is a very nice style. It takes a little bit more intentional with designing it and cutting the glass. Glass, you also worry about, if limbs could fall down, fruit could fall down. If you have it in an area that, something could break it, hail could break glass. A lot of these other options, plastic and so forth, are less expensive if things were to happen. So here are a few more styles. And you may have heard the term wapini, but that's also similar to what this book is calling a sun pit. And that's just basically burying or digging down into a space that you're using the cooler area underneath, where the ground is really cool, but still allowing the sun to come through at its low winter sun and come in and warm up the space. And then to the right, we have a barn style greenhouse, that barn type shape. It also dissipates, does a good job of getting plenty of sun and give you plenty of headroom inside. And then it does a little bit less in terms of snow weight, how it kind of sheds it. But those are things to think about. And then lower left, you have that same kind of slant style. You worry about the plastic you're using. If you're just using kind of a painter's plastic or a greenhouse plastic, you got to consider about the snow on that, and maybe it needs to be reinforced in some situations. Uh, and then the last one is over to the right is one of my favorite ones, those lean-to greenhouses. And you can have that, all of those joints can kind of mate up with the home at any point underneath the gutters, at different points around a sunroom, or a bay window, or a sliding door. So there's a lot of options what you can do with the lean-to. And then lastly, these last two are, you can have that angle style that is a lean-to, which was in one of the cross sections earlier. And then, as I mentioned earlier, that you can have the flow, that greenhouse acts as a sunroom that heats your house, which is kind of a win-win in so many respects. You get the plants in your, so to speak, living room, but it also allows you to use less energy throughout winter. And so just some kind of technical numbers and things to consider. This is in a very good book called Winter Greenhouse Gardening, and I'll show that to you in the next slide here. Whether you use the material is either glass, a rigid plastic, or a plastic film, that you understand that how much light is coming through, what kind of heat loss you're experiencing, and then the estimated life of being able to use, how long will all these materials last. So these are all things to consider when you're designing your greenhouse and understanding what is a good use for you and your greenhouse. Here are some examples of our greenhouses down at Omaha Permaculture. And just at the top two photos is that kind of cold frame setup, unheated greenhouse after snow. And as you can tell, the snow kind of sits there in its form, and it has already slid off a few times, and it is kind of built up as a base around the edges. But for the most part, the heat within the greenhouse keeps it melting and shedding, so that it doesn't just sit there and then want to collapse the greenhouse. And we make sure we have a support beam underneath the ribs of there, so that a collapse of the actual frame would never happen. If anything, it would probably compromise the plastic itself. And then the picture on the upper right is a greenhouse that we have, a south facing, and this photo is right after all of the snow that had accumulated the day before had slid off the greenhouse. And because this is a lean-to, and it's relying on some of the heat that's already been stored in the building, it actually was warm enough to melt or at least lubricate the snow that had collected on that Lexan so that it all would slide off and eventually all by itself. No excess or added energy necessary to make this happen. Sometimes you may have to go out there with a broom just to kind of encourage, an area where it may be frozen on the edge, where it's a little overhang. But for the most part, if you angle it correctly, the weight of the snow on a wet, heavy snow, it wants to slide and it wants to leave. And then on the lower pictures is a kind of that black barrel I mentioned earlier. And then you fill it with water and it creates a heat bank. So on those cold nights, it at least adds, 2 to 5 degrees warmer and retaining for this this cold frame. This is unheated greenhouse, and this is a 12 by 20 size. So it's about 12 feet wide, 20 feet long, and I think this is the right size for a scale of your own backyard. But obviously, you might be interested in doing bigger things if you're talking about your farm or your homestead. And then being able to plant it in garden beds, like we've done raised beds, sometimes is necessary if the soil is not good. But all of these kind of greenhouses can be built with any materials that you get at your box store, just bent electrical conduit and just your standard 2x2s, and then painter's plastic. We use painter's plastic because it's a little bit cheaper, but also it's kind of an upcycled item because painter's plastic is inherently by design, it's a throwaway item for a painter. But we're making sure we get 6 months of daily use out of this painter's plastic. And by that time, that come June, when the weather gets warmer, this plastic wants to kind of break up and fall apart. So it is at that time that you can actually remove the plastic and you really don't need it much more for the rest of the year. And so here's that book I mentioned earlier that kind of highlights a lot of these details. So, I mean, I really could flush out a whole PowerPoint about his concepts, but Elliot Coleman in this book, The Winter Harvest Handbook, is really where the encyclopedia for all this knowledge. And just an example is this really fun graph on the left here that highlights when you would want to be planting and when you would potentially be able to harvest some of the things that you would want to do over the winter. So if you have a really, and it has 2 different graphs there for if you have a cool house or a really cold house. A cold house is not heated whatsoever. The cool house would be more of a lean-to approach. But basically it's showing that if you were to plant, and that left on that spine is actually the planting dates. So it tells you if you plant here, that you would be expecting to harvest, in such and such days. So you'd be able to graph and understand and be able to predict the fact that it's getting colder, that you're using less energy, you're not using any energy to heat your space, but be able to predict and know when you are harvesting spinach, for example, or any other kind of wintertime vegetables. Do we have a question by any chance? I'm looking up there.
Yeah, it looks like we have one that says, did you site your greenhouses north to south or east to west?
Ooh, I like that question. And I didn't put a graphic for that. So if they're rectangular, obviously, okay, lean-to design aside, because you're kind of, that's predetermined if you're have a south-facing approach. But basically, I like to site them in a rectangular facing north and south because our most prevailing winds are coming from a north or south rather than an east and west. And that north and south wind allows to make sure that when I am venting those greenhouses on a regular basis without a fan, without the assistance of a fan, that I'm letting that wind do its best work. So that on a south wind driven day or a north wind driven day, that my vents will get plenty of wind pressure from both of those wind directions to push that hot air, sometimes too hot air in your greenhouse. You don't want it to sit in there long. You want it to get refreshed. So I orient it north-south because I don't think you're losing anything. If you were to orient, for example, hypothetically, you're not losing any solar gain. I believe if you were to orient it the other direction, because the sun, travels over the sky, and as long as your greenhouse is not being blocked and shaded by other structures, I personally recommend that our north-south wind and being able to refresh the greenhouse air ends up being the most important reason. But thanks for the question. I hope that answers it. Okay. All right. I'll move on to the next one. So next, the last couple slides here, I'm going to talk about how our nonprofit tries to apply permaculture principles to urban green spaces. And I'll talk a little bit about not only the greenhouses, but what we're doing with vacant properties. So on vacant properties, there's actually a lot of old trees that, they fell their limbs and trunks, and we work with the city, and we do wood milling and construction workshops and on site at our place in North Omaha. And we cut and dry that wood so that it eventually can be used for garden infrastructure, whether it's picnic tables, garden benches, tool sheds, and garden signs. So all of these is, a way to kind of not require a box store to be able to get your construction materials. And here's a great example. Here's one of our community gardens. This is Tiffany, and highlighting all the different things, the built garden infrastructure that makes your garden feel a little bit more cozy for the neighborhood. So it's nice to have a garden sign, the picnic table, a tool shed in the background. But we have this model where we work with a community champion or community leader to kind of lead the activities in the season and make sure that it is all organized throughout the year. We also do and teach workshops about backyard egg-laying hens and being able to host your own or have your own flock and build your own coop. So we assist people to create their own coop or run, as well as site it. And then we also teach people how to reduce the costs of feed by supplementing with kitchen scraps or finding it in your neighborhood. And then best practices for a healthy flock year round. And just the reason we talk so much about backyard chickens is because sometimes the greenhouses aren't always growing a lot in winter, and that it's nice to be able to have a little protein ball from those eggs in the middle of January and February. So a backyard flock is a really great way to kind of supplement your self-sufficiency and being able to feed yourself. And then, as we mentioned earlier, the topic of the evening is how to build your own backyard scale greenhouses. And we try to lower the cost of construction so that people can do it in lower income situations. And then being able to grow food in the other 6 months is something that, it's not rocket science. It's just being able to have the right place to do it. And as you can tell, if you time it correctly, you could actually have a salad bar outside in your backyard that you could be plucking from throughout the entire winter, and being able to make it successive so that the plants are growing in maturity as the winter goes on, so that you always have a fresh young crop. There are many ways to kind of successively make that happen. So being able to do backyard cold frame or greenhouses, I think it's very important for people living in Nebraska. And it's great to smell the fresh greens, even in the middle, or especially in the middle of winter. And then we have a new headquarters site we call it Green Space up in North Omaha. This is a rendering of what we would like to envision in the next 5 years. It's an 8-acre site, and we do all these workshops there on site. We have the chickens, we have bees, there will be a future community bike trail, and potentially a community kitchen. and all of those wood processing activities as well. So this is something we purchased this building 2 years ago, June of 2022. And we are looking to ramp up and rehabilitate this old property so that it provides permaculture demonstrations year round. And so I'm kind of wrapping up here the discussion tonight, but I have a little story about this picture. This is a countertop full of food, but please try to do some gardening, and especially if you're new to it, because one year we had people that were very excited about gardening, and they came out early in spring, and we seeded all these plants and so forth, and we put it in the garden. And then come the summer, they went off and did summer things. They went on vacations, and they really didn't want to help me do the weeding on the property. So we kind of let this garden overrun itself. And come August and September, we walked back to this garden, and we were wondering, like, I wonder if it did well. Well, underneath all those weeds, we peel it all back. We found a lot of food, and this whole countertop is full of gardens and its productivity, and that's with laziness. So basically, if you have the desire to try it, don't be scared for getting involved with it. Even doing a few of the first early steps could be rewarded. So don't feel like you need a super green thumb or anything along those lines. I think that everybody should try it and learn their first year. And so lastly, I guess our Omaha works through vacant properties. That's what this graph is on the left-hand side around vacant property. All those little black dots are vacant properties, and we're trying to improve the soil on all these vacant properties. So our mission is to foster community through sustainable land stewardship. Thank you for watching our webinar this evening.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Gus. There should be a feedback survey popping up on your guys' screen right now. If you guys could take it, that would be amazing. It just helps us keep putting on programs like this. We do have a couple questions for you, Gus, that weren't put in the Q&A. One question was, how small can you make a hoop house greenhouse?
So I would say I would not go too small, simply because how cold we get in Nebraska. And that backyard greenhouse that I showed you at the 12 by 20 scale, I would like to suggest that that's as small as you should get. I think that's the proper size and worthy of your efforts. If you go smaller than that, it's harder to keep that warm, if that makes sense. A smaller greenhouse gets colder a lot quicker. The 12 by 20 size has 6 feet before you get to that middle path. That's 6 feet in the middle of the path of that cold frame. The ground is technically in the 50s, 40 degrees in the middle of the greenhouse. If even though it may be -10 outside, the 50-degree soil is inside the greenhouse, 6 feet away from the outside surface. So if you had, a smaller space, 6 by 10 or something, then you're reducing the amount of space you have between and allowing that buffer to keep the greenhouse warm. I hope this makes sense. It's all about really the more space, the better, because it stays and even in those beds and everything, it's retaining that heat longer than it would if you had a smaller space. So I know they make a lot of small greenhouse kits and everything, and they look cute and they look really fun, but I kind of want to resist you, I want to teach you to kind of resist those kind of smaller spaces, even though you may not have ambitions to do bigger things. I think that this 12 by 20 is the right size in order for it to reward your efforts.
Okay, amazing. And this is kind of related. You mentioned using plastic for the greenhouses especially, the hoop houses. Is there a good alternative that you know of to using plastic to cover those greenhouses, or is that the best material we have access to right now?
Unfortunately, it kills me. I mean, I hate single-use plastic, and I just, the justification is the fact that you're using this, what would be a disposable plastic, painter's plastic, a single-use item. We're using it every day, all day for 6 months. So that is not exactly ideal, but we know that we end up having to tear the top off it to fully vent. You could be buying greenhouse plastic bought by a greenhouse retailer it's quite a bit more expensive, but you should be able to get 3 years out of that plastic that they sell compared to that painter's plastic. And then there's the Lexan, which is kind of a corrugated plastic that actually does well. And as long as, you don't get hit by hail very often, I've seen it resist getting dinged because it's got that corrugated reinforced structure. It looks like cardboard from the profile. And so hail really has to come hard and persistent. And it costs a little bit of money, but that Lexan, as long as it isn't compromised by hail, it'll last a long time, 30, 50 years. You could reuse it for other structures, after it's kind of changed a little bit. And then glass, you really can't replace glass, you can't, that's the best, in some respect, but doesn't have the thermal value. The Lexan at least has a little bit of thermal value. So, and then glass doesn't get, if it got hit by hail, that's broken, right away. I've even seen people's greenhouse plastic or greenhouse glass that was too close to an apple tree, and apples broke those corner glasses, so it doesn't take much to break the glass. Just you gotta baby it a little bit better. So it really understanding those choices, and maybe you start off with plastic, eventually move to something else as you learn the system and as you understand it. But yeah, there are decent options out there. And I guess I would recommend going with Lexan. All those corrugated options are the best, I think.
Okay, and then just one last one. What challenges have you personally faced building greenhouses, and are there any advice you'd give to help absolute beginners with greenhouses?
In terms of building, was it a building question?
Yeah. What challenges have you faced building greenhouses?
Yeah. So I highly recommend you that you really think out the site and really know where you want it, because and then where you want that air to go when it's summer, and where you want that air to go in winter. So if you understand those things, I think that it kind of designs itself. One of the main features that I guess I could have made a graphic for this evening, but I didn't, was about where to vent your air. So at the peak or at the height of every little cold frame or greenhouse, that's where your hottest air collects. So having a vent at the top where your head is, where you're walking through the highest spot, you want that air to leave quickly. And so being able to design a greenhouse that, has the proper venting so that you don't have to do an assisted fan or something. I think it's something to really consider. But always think about, where is that heat going to go? Hot season or summer season and winter season. And you can use that heat, in the winter. So I'd say the venting ends up being the most important part. Water is kind of another thing to consider. I put water tanks in some of our cold frames, not just in that black tank for heating, but also to add actually humidity in the greenhouse. I think open standing water and acting extra humidity is a good thing as well. So when you build your greenhouse space, maybe make enough area so that you can have an open tank of water.
Okay. Amazing. I just want to ask one question since you mentioned there was that question about how small you can make a hoop house greenhouse. Personally, I was wondering, you cautioned against those smaller, like, build your own greenhouse, your cute little greenhouse in your backyard. Would you say that if I were to have a smaller space, something quite small, like a 6x6, like very small, that it would be better for me to invest in something like raised beds rather than going for one of those greenhouse, cute little small backyard greenhouses?
So are you asking to kind of use the raised bed within that greenhouse?
Would it, I guess the question I'm asking is it worth the investment to get a smaller greenhouse, or should you put your money, if you can't get a larger greenhouse, should you put your money towards other gardening efforts such as raised beds and things like that, where when you eventually have more space, or if you're able to get more land at some point or have a community garden, then you'll be able to have a greenhouse? Because I know, especially within Omaha, there's a lot of people who don't have, that much space. There's all
Yep.
the HOA things. So if you have a smaller space, is a greenhouse worth considering, or should people be putting their effort and money elsewhere?
Okay, no, thanks for clarifying. And
Thank you.
yes, so I would say that I want to make sure your first greenhouse experiences are worthwhile and good. And those small ones, I honestly don't think most people will enjoy them. I've seen you can pack a lot of stuff in there. If you think about it, you also have to pack in your tools. You got to pack in like a prep station for putting your seedlings in there. So you end up using a lot of that space for countertop and space. And so there ends up not being a whole lot of growing space sometimes. And those smaller greenhouses, I guess the main reason I was cautioning it was because I don't think that they stay as warm as well.
Mhm.
Unless you lean them up against the south face of your building, they feel protected in some sort. So if you're able to kind of tuck it in an area that's not wind prone, that might be fine. That might be a great use of it. I guess I have also those small ones. I've seen it get dumped on with snow, and
Mhm.
then people have to use a shovel or a broom to clean them because they don't heat well. So they don't. People will like plug in heaters in there just to get it warm, just to heat it up to melt the snow off of them. So they may be a hassle, is all I'm getting. And I don't want to set up anyone for for not having a good time.
Oh,
I
yeah.
want to make sure that your first time doing this, it was done right with intentionality. And yes, I understand the excitement. Those are really cute greenhouses, and I see them, and I've had my family even ask me for them too. Uh, and we end up still running into these kind of little frustrations, and I hate hearing their frustrations because I was like, gosh, I really would have wished you would have gone a little bigger.
Mhm.
And it is what it is. It's those smaller ones are not as resilient, and they don't hold as much heat, and whatever. It is those things.
Yeah.
Um, as a consolation prize, if you have just a south facing window, maybe making kind of shelves on the inside sill, maybe that's your mini greenhouse instead. You're like your halfway point before you
Mhm.
get into a bigger, because just a south facing, and then let's say you have to add an additional LED light above it just to give it a little bit more light.
Yeah.
I still think that's better than having the mini greenhouse.
Mhm. And then we do have one question that just came in from Lisa. Are you aware of any individuals or companies who do assemble like greenhouse kit type of things in our area in Omaha and Nebraska?
I don't know of anyone that is a local entity that assembles them, come build them, or anything like that. Geez, yeah, no, it's not very common here.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, as Omaha permaculture was coming on the scene, roughly 10, 12 years ago, I was able to see on Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist, everybody was taking their greenhouses down just because
Mm-hmm.
people don't know how to use them, or people are, it's become cheaper to source your plants from a Costco or some larger box stores because they're they provide a good product, you know, all the time. It's some it's just not organic most of the time. So if you want to control your seeding process and everything, you know, that's for you. That's the greenhouse. That's why the greenhouse is for you. You know, not for the people that, you know, want to go out and buy this at the box store. You do save money, but you also know it's more organic. You know, those are all the big reasons of why I think a greenhouse is more fun and you know, more eco-friendly, all those things.
Okay, amazing. I think that is it. Thank you so much for being with here and giving us your time tonight, Gus.
Of course.
Thank everybody who joined and everybody who's still here who hung on and watched the questions. Like I said, this will be up on our YouTube channel for you to review any information. And then Gus can be found at omahapermaculture.org if you'd like to follow up and learn more about the organization or volunteer down there. Okay,
Thank you,
thank you
Kat.
guys so much. Thank you. Have a good night.